Good morning, everyone. Aloha, aloha. I'm so glad that you can join me this morning for this talking story session. And if you've joined me before on these, you know that talking story is a phrase that we use in Hawaii. It's a way in which we engage one another. We get to know one another by simply being together and sharing about our lives. And I couldn't think of a better and more appropriate way of doing these interviews with people of color. And I know that for many of you, just being able to hear people's stories and hear about their passions in life, it's really important. And of course, in all of these interviews, we've been broaching the subject of racial justice and diversity and inclusion. And this morning, I am really, really excited to have a friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Ken Fong. He and I go back a long, long ways. We overlapped some time at Fuller Seminary back in the late 70s, early 80s. And in fact, I know his wife even longer than Ken. She and I grew up in the same Christian church in Honolulu, and we affectionately called her Snoopy. She was a high school student, and we did a Christian play at the church. And I believe that's how she got the name Snoopy. She played the part of Snoopy in this play. And so I've known Ken and Sharon for many, many years. And Ken has been in pastoral ministry, had been in pastoral ministry, I think maybe over 36 years, Ken, down in Los Angeles.
40 years, yeah.
40 years, okay.
Yeah.
In fact, he was already pastoring, I think, when we were in seminary at the church. And if you've read the bio, you know too that he's had a podcast, Asian America, the Ken Fong podcast since 2015, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. And I was telling Ken that I listen very faithfully to his podcast. I find it so insightful and so helpful as he interviews people from the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. It's been wonderful for me to listen to them, and I would hope that you might be able to listen to some of his podcasts as well, and we'll put that up in the chat room a little later, the link to it. So Ken, one of my favorite writers, of course, and I'm sure yours too, is Jim Wallace of Sojourner. Yeah. And I listen to his podcast, and I love the way he begins his podcast by asking his guests, which I want to ask you. How is your spirit these days in light of all that we've experienced in the last year?
Yeah, I'll get to that in 1 second. First thing I want to say, thank you for not casting my wife as Pepe Le Pew or Porky Pig, because
yeah.
that would have been a much harder nickname for her to carry forward the rest of her life.
She would have hated us for the rest of her life.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yesterday, was a typical day, just doing stuff, and then I got a text message from a former church member who said, when you get a chance, please call me. I had no idea what this is about. And when I finally got around to calling him, he shared that yesterday morning, two former board members of my former church and longtime friends of ours, their only son, 21 years old, committed suicide. Oh. And so I'm still reeling from that. I mean, Snoopy and I went over to spend time with them. And this is just, 5 hours after all of this happened. And, you went to Fuller, that iconic bridge on Colorado Boulevard, like they put up all these barriers, but he had thought this thing all the way through. He took off his shoes so his toes can fit in the little mesh holes. And it's like 1,400 feet. Oh. And yeah, so I have no words to describe how devastated we're feeling. So when you ask about my spirit, that's dominating my spirit right now, Gerald. I think no parent expects to outlive any of their children. If your child dies because of someone shoots them or it's an accident, that's horrible. But I think the pinnacle of devastation for a parent is if their child takes their own life. Right. So my old church and the wider community are just hearing the news now, right? It's just getting out. I've created a little Facebook message group with his former Sunday school teachers, and he was just a precious human being. And to hear that he was struggling with depression, like nobody saw this coming. And he was under care. He was getting some meds, but they weren't helping. But then he felt like he had this breakthrough where he just understood that he wasn't meant to be on this earth a long time. Felt like God told him that.
Oh.
Wrote his family a note and took off in his car to go to the bridge while his family was asleep the other night.
Oh.
So it's something that it just kind of dominates the view screen. Yeah.
I'm really sorry to hear that, and I'm sure his family must be so devastated by it.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. But so that's all I can think of when you ask me how my spirit is doing. It's very, very heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in spite of it, I do thank you for being with me today. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Before we go on, I wanted to also mention to our listeners that if you have questions for Ken or myself, you can go to the Q&A on the bottom and you can type in your questions and we'll get to them when we can. As I mentioned earlier, Ken and I have known each other for a really long time. And so I know some of Ken's history. But for those of you listening, I asked Ken earlier if he wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about his background, where he came from, and especially how he found his passion, especially in his first love, which was pastoral ministry. As we mentioned, he was a pastor in Los Angeles at the Evergreen Baptist Church for over 40 years. So Ken, could you share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got into pastoral ministry? Yeah.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't clarify that not only did you and my wife go to the same church, but you were one of her youth pastors.
Yeah.
So that just shows that you're not the same age, right?
Yeah. But I'm not that much older than she. Yeah.
Right,
I was in college when I was doing that.
Okay, but when she was in high school, anybody out of high school is really old. So
yeah. For them, I was really old.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Sacramento, California. I am a third generation American of Chinese descent. So my dad's side of the family, they came to the U.S. probably like the 1913, 1914, when my grandfather was a teenager. Baptist missionaries had taught him actually how to speak English without an accent before he came. So I think one of his first jobs was as an interpreter. And then, he finally went back and got his wife, my grandma, from the village. And the story I love about that is she had never left the village in her entire life. And so, they have their baby daughter. He packs them both up, puts them on the buckboard. I don't know how many days going from this village. It took us in a car 4 hours to get from Guangzhou to this village. So imagine how long it took them on a buckboard. So my grandmother's crying her eyes out, just afraid of the unknown, right? Leaving this little world. So by the time they get to the seaport, her eyes are swollen red and almost shut from crying every day. And so the guy at the gangplank, he looks at her and he's like, she's got some kind of infectious disease. There's no way she's getting on my ship. So my grandfather had to pack her and his daughter back up and take her on the buckboard all the way back to the village and say, all right, I'll go back to America and then I'll come back a few years later. And then, that's what he did. So definitely my roots are pretty long as far as some Asians go. I've met some Chinese Americans whose ancestors worked on the railroad. They're like fifth generation, which kind of blows my mind. But all of that is to say is my dad, he was born and raised here. So was my mom. My dad fought in World War II. He's posthumously one of the recipients of this new Congressional Gold Medal recognition for Chinese American veterans. So growing up, I totally didn't identify with the Chinese side. I really, really wanted to see myself as American. I don't speak Chinese. The only time my parents would speak like the village dialect Chinese at home was when they wanted to talk in front of the kids so we wouldn't understand.
Yeah.
Right. So you know how I go. So I know what bad boy means in Cantonese. I know what monkey means, mischievous.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that doesn't help me in general, conversation. You can't preach a sermon just talking about monkeys and bad boys. So that was fine with me because I was like, yeah, I'm American. And one of the earliest wake up calls to the fact that I still to this day am seen as not quite American is in second grade. This little red hair, freckle faced girl, Patty McKinney, and I really liked each other. And we were just spending every recess together. And then maybe 3 weeks into our relationship, she comes to me and says, we can't get married. I said, well, I wasn't planning on proposing yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're kind of serious here. What are you talking about? And she said, yeah, we can't get married because you're Chinese.
Mm. Mm.
And I still remember that moment, Gerald. It's just like, what is going on? Like in spite of the fact that I speak perfect English, right? My clothes are bought from the store. I get a professional haircut. My parents speak English without an accent. It's like all of a sudden I'm being called out as perpetual foreigner. And my mom had been raising me, and then later on my two younger brothers, to potentially be the president of the United States.
Oh.
And that's one of the reasons why she said, I'm not sending you to Chinese school like all your other friends, thank God, right? Because you will never be the president if you speak English with an accent.
Mm. Mm.
Okay, so I look back now and I realize how much the racialization of my parents' experience growing up in this country, right, and all the stories they've never told me, it shaped and molded even how my parents were raising us. Yeah. But when Patty said, we can't ever get married because you're Chinese, that really made me realize that I can't take off my face.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So no matter how else I am assimilated, it's like I'm not white. Mm. Right. Now, fast forward a million times, and my brother, who stayed in Sacramento, his daughter got really into horseback riding. And guess who she meets at the stables but Patty McKinney. So I actually got to see her. She's married up and she's wearing all kinds of flashy jewelry and stuff like that. But I don't know if she even remembers that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if she remembers.
Oh yeah, and I didn't want to bring it up. But I'm telling you, even at that young of a stage of my life, that was a marker. Now, yeah. I was going to church with my family. The First Chinese Baptist Church in Sacramento is the second oldest Baptist work among Chinese west of the Mississippi. I think they're getting close to their 150th anniversary. Okay, wow. So this church was started, get this, when Abraham Lincoln was president.
Wow.
Okay. And yet, when I'm growing up there, it's still a bilingual church. There's a Cantonese, congregation, and then even during the English service, our ministers would either have an interpreter or they would translate themselves. And all of that is to say is, I loved going to church. I loved being a Christian, but the example of pastor was completely not who I saw myself to be. Hmm. So they were much more, our family, we had this term called China-fied. Like, in order to be the pastor of this church, you had to be bilingual. Okay, so that means you grew up probably in some Chinatown somewhere, and you are much less assimilated than I am. And so as much as I loved going to church, loved being a Christian, the idea that I would be a pastor was the antithesis of what I was being raised to be. Huh. Okay, so I got really involved. And then I went off to college. Cal Berkeley, was a bio major, was pre-dental, pre-med. And then realized by my senior year, I really didn't want to do those things. Yeah. But now with panicking, it's like, oh, it's my senior year. I'm a bio-sci major. What am I going to do? And I just looked in the public health catalog because I still want to make a lot of money and be involved with health. And it's like, oh, you can get a master's of hospital administration. So, something to tell people. So I applied to that. They didn't take me, thank God, because I avoided taking business classes like the plague because I can't stand that stuff. Even as a pastor, I hired an executive pastor to run the operation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I graduate for the first time in my life. I have no idea what I'm going to be when I grow up. Ever since ninth grade, I'm voted by my classmates most likely to succeed, most likely to be a doctor. And now it's all just come to nothing. And so I remember coming out of my last interview for public health thing where I knew they were going to take me, and I had to go back to my apartment and face my roommates' questions like, how did it go? And I just remember looking up at the tall trees in the sky and talking to God and saying, what are you doing? Like this is not working out for me. And I don't know. I feel like going over to that redwood tree and kicking it down with my foot. So I have to go home. And I'm my dad's oldest son, the first one that he's paid for a college degree from Cal, and I have to face his questions. So I come home that summer, and he's like, so what did I just pay for? I go, biology degree. So when are you going to biologize? I didn't know that was a word. Yeah. And I said, well, you don't understand, Dad. I was never planning to be a biologist. That was like prerequisites for dental school and med school, but I'm not going to do that anymore. He says, well, you can't just not do nothing. And so just to get my dad off my back, I took the part-time job at my old First Chinese Baptist Church as the youth director, even though I was never going to be a pastor, right? And the youth group, with the help of this one mom of younger kids, she was like the earth mother. We were a dynamic duo, and the youth group like quintupled in size. And we were drawing kids from the two major high schools. We had so many kids out for the youth meeting that the student government usually had their meeting on the same night as our youth group. They had to change the night of their meeting.
Wow.
Yeah. It was just like, but all along, Gerald, I'm going, well, this is just my part-time gap filler because I'm not going to be a pastor. Okay. So to kind of cut to the chase, Asian American Baptist pastors are watching me. Okay. And there's this one in particular in San Francisco, Chinatown. He pulls me aside and he says, like, so Ken, I was born in San Francisco, Chinatown. I speak fluent Chinese, but my dialect, like your home dialect, is too uncouth to use in public. So I took private Cantonese formal tutoring lessons for 10 years. So when are you going to start taking Cantonese lessons? Right. And I'm like, I'm trying to be respectful.
FaceTime video.
Oh, hold on a second. Like, I'm trying to be respectful, but it's like, you know what? Finally, I said, look, I'm not from Chinatown. I get the wrong food when I try to order in Chinese. So we actually are, even though we're both Chinese American, I'm going to reach a different group of people. And so I don't know if your non-Asian audience can appreciate how disrespectful I was being.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this guy is mentoring me. He has his PhD, right? He's one of the icons and lions of our denomination as far as Asian Americans concerned. And I just go, thanks for sharing, not doing it.
Yeah.
So I went to American Baptist Seminary of the West that first year, and then realized that I needed something more rigorous and more evangelical. And so that's when I transferred to Fuller. And I came down to check Fuller out, and you were the first person that I met.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. You were walking in, there was some kind of shaded portico, and you were walking towards me, and you introduced yourself. Yeah, and I think that's when we made the Snoopy connection.
Oh.
Yeah. So all of that is to say, I realized that there was a calling that God had in my life that didn't necessarily fit. It didn't fit what other people understood or could see, but that didn't mean my calling was invalid.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this last quick story. I mean, I went to talk to the godfather of American-born Chinese Ministries. And I said, I just totally, now I'm 24, I'm at Fuller, right? I go, I totally disagree with your model of trying to have American-born Chinese like me kowtow to the immigrant Chinese in order for us to get a toehold in their church. And this is what he said, Gerald. Ken, you're 30 years ahead of your time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
He's like, and he was pastoring the first Chinese church in Honolulu at the time. So I was over there to meet my in-laws, and I asked to have a meeting with him. Okay.
Wow.
So again, disrespectful me. He's like 30 years ahead of time. You need to learn how to speak Chinese, wear a short sleeve white shirt and a black tie, even to the church picnic.
Yeah.
Right?
I remember that.
Yeah. And so maybe if you keep your head down and your mouth shut, and you emphasize Chinese values over American values, maybe after 30 years, some of your crazy ideas, they'll let you do them.
Yeah.
And 24-year-old me looks at him and I go, I don't even think I said respectfully. I said, so who's to say that you're right and I'm wrong? I said, I don't think I'm 30 years too soon. I think I'm right on time and you just can't see it.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
I'm sure he loved that.
Right. And then, I look back and he says, Ken, the Chinese church in America is basically run by immigrant mafia. And I look back now and I'm sure he's reflecting a lot of his own toil and trouble. But he says, there's only one game. They control it. You got to play by their rules. And I said, well, I just decided at 24 years old, not even graduated yet from seminary, that I'm going to start my own game. And in this game, I get to play right now, even though I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And he goes, well, they're never going to bless that game. And I'm like, well, in my game, I only need God's blessing. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to flame out and burn up, right?
Yeah.
So I saw him at a dim sum restaurant in Arcadia 29 years later. Okay, he's in his 80s, he's in bad health. I went over to the side, I said, hey, Dr. Wong. And he goes like, so I've been watching you. I go, yeah. And he was like, I got to hand it to you. You stuck to your guns. And even though we weren't endorsing you, you went ahead and did it. And you've learned and accomplished so much. So I got to give him credit. And so all of that is to say is, now that I'm older than he was when he told me I was 30 years too soon, and I'm talking to these young up and coming Asian seminarians and stuff, I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
Right. So this guy, I want to do a rap ministry. I'm like, tell me more.
Yeah.
How can I open the door for you?
Yeah. Well, I'm so amazed because when we were pastoring churches in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, ethnic Asian churches were changing.
Yes.
And I think Evergreen, where you were at, that was sort of the model for the changes that were taking place. I had mentioned this to some people in the church that when I went to Sturridge Presbyterian in San Mateo, it was a historic Japanese American church. But in the intervening years, it became more of an Asian American, Pan-Asian congregation. And so all the kind of work that the first generation and second generation pastors were doing, we're slowly losing their impact because now we were facing a totally different kind of Asian American community. And so your church, Evergreen, was one of those churches that I think all of us Asian American pastors were looking to. And it was beneficial for us that you started to do that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I feel like both my marriage choice, I married a Japanese American, albeit from Hawaii, and then ending up at this, what I would call a Japanese church that was nice to Chinese people. Okay, so they didn't have a master plan. It's like, oh, well, our kids are dating Chinese kids and Mexican kids and white kids, and they're getting married, and their friendship circle is more than just Japanese Americans. And then Chinese churches that I had described before were bumping up against this problem with the young adults like me going, I can't relate to these immigrant pastors. I'm not saying you're bad. It's just like, that's just not me. So, hey, there's this historic Japanese church with an older Sansei, third generation Japanese American pastor who was quarterback in high school. Like, hey, let's go over there. They didn't invite us, but let's go. I said, that's so Chinese.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, if it was the reverse, if it was a Chinese church and Japanese or Korean people started self-inviting them, I'm sure most Chinese churches back then would go, excuse me, why are you here?
Yeah.
Right.
That is so true.
Yeah. So it's so, I just see how God kind of used even culture and history. So it took my showing up with my experience and my wife to say, what if God's doing something new here?
Yeah.
How might we morph from a Japanese church that's nice to Chinese people to becoming a fully affirming Chinese-Japanese church?
Mhm.
And they were nice enough, and that's what I did my doctoral studies in. They were nice enough to go, I think God's speaking through him. And so I became kind of the architect of that plan.
Mm. And I really love that, because I think it also shows that not Asians are the same.
No,
We come from very different backgrounds. And
very different.
Yeah, very different. So there's a question in the chat room for you, Ken. Did your father finally accept the path that you chose?
Oh, good question. Well, again, a little kind of cultural window here. So my pastor at the time at First Chinese, his father was the first self-made millionaire in Chinatown, San Francisco. He built an insurance business. So when his son, my pastor, went into the ministry, his dad was really upset because you're my only son. I'm supposed to pass this on to you. So he had to find a cousin. I'm sure it wasn't hard to take over his. So when he counseled me, he said, unless your father actually blesses you going to seminary, then I don't think you should go.
Oh.
Yeah. And my dad was the only one in my family who wasn't a Christian.
Oh.
Okay. So I'm looking at the face of this and I'm like, you're basically setting me up. And, I've already given you 2 examples where I'm okay being disrespectful. Okay. But this is my dad. So I had to figure it out myself. So I said, I'm not going to ask him for permission or a blessing, because if he withholds it, then I really look bad.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask him for his opinion. Okay. So I sat down in the living room. I go, so Dad, I'm really thinking after a year out of college that God's calling me to be a minister. And I know that's very subjective and esoteric, but just kind of curious what you think about that. Okay. And he goes, I think that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard.
Oh, no.
Okay. Right. And then they're like, thanks for sharing. Right. Right. But imagine how it would have gone if it said, and I'll only go if you bless it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then my dad, he's a self-made guy. He's very practical. He goes, so, I'm not going to pay for this. You go, I just bought you a degree you're not going to use. You got 2 little brothers. I go, and this is what I've told younger Asian Americans, since. I go, you can't play both sides of this. You can't talk like an adult and still act like a dependent.
Yeah.
Okay. It makes no sense. So I said, you know what, Dad? I totally agree with you. I'm not expecting a dime from you. This is between me and God. And he's like, but you don't have any money. I go, that's not your problem. That's my problem. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I ended up graduating without even taking out a student loan.
Wow. Good for you, Ken.
Yeah. Okay. Now, years later, I led my dad to Christ and I baptized him.
Wow.
Yeah. So he came around, to a large extent. And I know he was we didn't have the closest relationship, but there was a lot of healing that happened in the last 5-6 years of our relationship, even though we're Northern Southern California. And, he told me he loved me and he told me he was proud of me. And it's just like, you know what? I'm good.
That's great. That's great, Ken. Those of you who might have read the Pastor Ken's bio know that he, in 2015, began Asian America, the Ken Fong podcast. And it's been recognized as one of the most important podcasts that we have. And it's almost, since 2015, has been downloaded, I think, almost 500,000 times now.
Yeah, we're a couple thousand short of 500,000. Yeah.
Yeah. And I listen to it regularly. And I wanted to ask Ken to share with you why it was so important for him to start this podcast and why he chose the kind of people that he has chosen to interview.
Well, thank you for asking. I will say this right at the outset, Gerald. It wasn't my idea. In fact, before I started the podcast, I had never even listened to one. So I had a former church member who now lives on the west part of Los Angeles, and he's a documentary filmmaker. And he and I were working on a film about my journey, which we'll talk about later, to lead the church on the LGBTQ affirming thing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we raised money on Indiegogo and all this stuff, but it kind of stalled out. Okay. So early in 2015, like January 2015, he says, "Hey, man, you ever thought about starting a podcast together?" I go, I think I know what a podcast is, but I don't listen to any. And I said, why? What are you thinking? And he's like, well, and we didn't know until later that year that 2015 was year of the podcast. That was the most significant burgeoning of new shows that the industry had ever seen. He said, look, number one, I think as this podcast world is opening up, there's still hardly anyone voicing it from an Asian American perspective.
Right.
Number two, you're already pretty well networked and known, social media and stuff like that. So we can build on that. Number three, even though I'm not thinking this would be a overtly Christian podcast, the fact that you wouldn't hide that you're a Christian or a pastor, I was still pastoring at the time, if the guest is open to having that part of the conversation, you could also have a light, he called it sprinkling of spirituality. Okay. And he says, don't worry, I'll handle all the technical side. And so off we went. And we have just put up our 301st episode. As of last fall, I'm now doing everything. He bowed out 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And then God raised up this young millennial, and she moved here from Texas to try to find a job in the industry with editing films and stuff like that. And when she finally landed a full-time job, she couldn't. I mean, I'm finding out how much work this takes.
Yeah.
She couldn't put in that time. And so literally in one 90-minute session, she came to my house and walked me through how to do all the technical side of it. And then it's on me. And what I love telling people is, I wasn't planning on retiring in 2017. I was 63. I was going to go to 65. But one of the main reasons why I retired a little earlier was I experienced since 2015 what it's like where I can actually say what I think without anyone threatening to fire me or expel me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because this show is completely mine. Like, I self-fund it. I'm not relying on the denomination or a church, right? No one can threaten, it's just like, well, if you don't like it, just don't listen.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I could have lived my entire adult life and never experienced not having the gun to my forehead. And any pastor knows what I'm saying. Anyone that works for a Christian nonprofit knows what I'm saying. Like, I had a former staff person who is now an executive director in our denomination. And, she was, and I'm so proud of her. She's so brilliant. But as she was moving to the headquarters, she says, I'm still going to say whatever I think. I go, no, you're not. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like, I totally get it. Mm-hmm. It's like, you represent now an organization.
Yeah.
And you basically have to give up that right. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, especially 3 years plus into retirement, the podcast not only gives me that experience, Gerald, but it's widened my lane of impact. So I'm not navigating this narrow Christian and then, Asian American, even if you wouldn't put it evangelical, it's like, we now are a fixture. Like, I built a reputation. Publishers of Asian American authors now contact me, right? I've been talking to NBC Universal, right? Those kind of things. So I love the fact that when they find out that I'm a former pastor, I'm a Christian, that they're kind of scratching their head.
Yeah.
Because I go, wait a minute, like, you have mostly non-Christian guests, right? And some of them are queer, right? Yeah. And it's like, I didn't know that Christians would allow that to happen. Right? And I'm like, well, some of us are curious.
Yeah.
So I feel like in its own way, it's been a witness, especially in this postmodern, post-MAGA sort of era, that people like, I didn't know that there's Christians out there that actually are like you. And it's like, wow, I have to think again. I go, well, that's all good for me.
Yeah. And I love the way your guests, some of whom are not believers, are inclined to even talk about what they're feeling, and even in their heart, and I find it so fascinating. And to our listeners, Ken has had a wide variety of guests, like Andrew Yang, who was a former presidential candidate. And just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about this before we started it. He interviewed William Hung. Some of you might remember American Idol, and William Hung was on that show. And so various kinds of people. And I think for myself, I listen to it, like I said, all the time religiously, because I'm learning too about Asian American and Pacific Islander culture just listening. So I hope that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I still haven't made all the pieces fit, but the Asian American Study Center at UCLA has reached out to me, and they want to digitally archive all of my episodes.
Wow.
And they have to teach me how to tag every episode with the Library of Congress language, because they said the stories that you have collected and are continuing to collect are so much a part of our history that we want future people to be able to access them. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic, Ken. I'll be looking forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah.
Hey, so Ken, we have about 25 minutes left. So I want to get to some of the heart of our time together with regard to the anti-Asian incidences that are occurring. So I want to roll two questions into one. For those in our church community and who are listening, who are Asian American themselves, we've all been victimized by racist behavior and attitude toward us. And a lot of us have had racial slurs, and we've been assaulted verbally. Could you help our Asian American listeners? What can we do if we're being verbally assaulted? And then on the other side of this question is for non-Asian people who are listening, what can you suggest to them in terms of being allies to Asian Americans?
I had a guest on recently who's an Asian American therapist, and she used a term that I'd never heard before, that she says is very much indicative of the Asian response typically. So there's like flight, fight, right? But she talked about fawning. I don't know if you remember that episode, Gerald.
I do.
And man, that just struck a chord in me. And I think part of the problem of those of us who are Asian American in figuring out how to respond to slurs and other hostilities is culturally, historically, we've been so trained, so indoctrinated, and so applauded for keeping our head down, right? For not complaining, for just keep doing our work, that sort of stuff. And I think the downside of fawning is that people who abuse us, they expect a very passive response. Okay. So I'm still struggling with this, and I have not been since Patty McKinney said she can't marry me. It's not like I live in Southern California. I don't, and the San Gabriel Valley, so there's lots of Asian American stuff. I haven't been on the receiving end of any kind of direct hostility, but as I kind of rehearse it in my mind, I think even though this really grates against my kind of fawning culture, and then add on top of that a kind of a Christian and retired pastorness, it's like, can I F-bomb somebody? Can I respond in a forceful way that says, I'm not going to take this? Okay. I think the video of that older woman, it could have been in the Bay Area, that was attacked, and then she took that piece of wood.
Yeah, San Francisco.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the unexpected response, and I'm not trying to encourage violence, but I'm saying unless we find our voice and use it, and even have the body language that says, no, you can't talk to me like that. No, I'm not going to take this. I'm videoing you, I'm reporting you. Don't just keep your head down and keep walking. I think that's going to be a tough hill to climb for a lot of us because it's just not how we've been generationally. But I think it requires that. Now, for the allies, I would say this. I've learned so much about being an ally, about being a straight ally, as I've come to know people who are gay and trans and completely not like me, right? And I think for them to actually see me as an ally is a greater compliment than if I claim to be an ally, if you understand the difference, right? Because I think so it's easy for a non-Asian person to go, well, I'm an ally, okay? It's another thing for an Asian American to go, you know what, you're really an ally. And I think for me, if there's some parallels here, it was entering their world on their terms, where I'm in the minority, where I'm not calling the shots, where I'm feeling like a fish out of water, and stay there long enough, hang out through my uncomfortableness until they, I feel like they're really behaving like they normally would. They're really talking like they normally would talk if I wasn't there, because I'm listening and I'm learning and I'm allowing their pain and their stories to percolate into my spirit, and I'm being transformed by that. I think you can't do this from a book. I think you can't just, it helps probably to go to a prayer vigil or a protest, but at some point, it's all superficial until you can really, you kind of have the smell, like you've been around enough that they go, no, you know our history. So I would say one thing you can do very practically is to put the work into listening to podcasts like mine and other resources out there. Learn the racist history of this country against Asian Pacific Islander people. It is one of the most deplorable histories. And while it's been more sporadic, kind of up and down, depending on, if we need a scapegoat, okay, compared to the Black American experience, which is horrible and unjust. But, let's not kid ourselves. In LA Chinatown, there was a lynching of like 19 Chinese that those guys never went to jail. That kind of stuff. So I think to be an ally, you need to put the work in to learn the history, even though it's painful, so that you understand, and you may be knowing more of the history than some of the Asian Americans know. Okay. Yeah. But you can't, let me put it positive. We need to have context all the time. Like, why is this a problem? Even with switching to Gerald Floyd, like even with the conviction of Chauvin, it's like you ask your Black friends, that didn't solve the problem. Okay. And you only understand that if you understand the history, the systemic racism in this country. And so you only understand it when you see how racist this country has been at the federal, state, and local level against Asian people. And we're, back to Patty McKinney, we're always going to be seen as less than fully American.
It's interesting. Last week, I was talking to the folks who were on the podcast, on the broadcast with me, that we're kind of victims on two opposite poles. One is the model minority, and the model minority myth is that we're hardworking, smart, intelligent people, which I'm sure we are. We really are, but that kind of is held over against other minority groups. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the perpetual foreigner. Right. We're just not really fully integrated into white culture. And so we ourselves are having, and it's to your point that sometimes we're so passive that we're not even ourselves fighting against these stereotypes. And yesterday, this may or not be helpful, but yesterday when I was on my walk, I was on the Iron Horse Trail, which is near my home. I was noticing coming toward me a biker. He was slowing down, and he was kind of moving toward my path, and I could see he was looking down on the path, and he stopped just as I was walking by, And so I moved over to the other side, but I kept looking backwards, and I noticed that he turned around and was coming back toward me.
Hmm.
So I kept look, and I was thinking internally, what am I going to do if he's going to try to do something
Yeah.
toward me? But to your point, that I was already thinking, I'm not going to not say anything if he says something to me, or if he
Right.
even tries to attack me. And it's a whole different uh, environment for me now, in terms of being
Yeah.
cognizant of my
Right.
surroundings, and knowing, and I'm already prepared to say certain things. I already have lines in my mind,
Are
so I think it's really important. But
you going to say it in pigeon?
yeah, I think that way, if I think if I did, they'll think I'm really a foreigner.
Well, here's definitely a related and I think relevant point for those who would like to be considered allies, is to sit in the discomfort of white Christian nationalism, right? And to own how the racist history of this country against people of color, including indigenous people, has been intricately and intimately intertwined with this Christian nationalism. Okay. And until we see how those two things are interlaced, it's like you're not really seeing everything.
Mm, mm. And yeah, and it's very uncomfortable sitting
Yeah.
in there. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I'm part of historically white denominations,
yes, yeah.
right? I've been on national Christian nonprofit boards that have historic, white roots. And, I've seen a great deal of progress made and effort made. But if the seats of power are still occupied by whites, and especially white males, and then when I first was on the university board, I was one of the first Asian Americans to be invited there. And I walk in a room, and that's the most rich white people I've ever been around.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. And I was welcomed with open arms. But when it came time to writing big checks, mine weren't that big.
Uh, compared.
Yeah,
Right.
and so there was this, imposter syndrome sort of thing. So I think even I had a guest on a while back who was talking about this book, Sung Chan Ra, like he and his Native American author friend, they're saying, well, I think it was United Methodists. They had written this big confession how they had stolen Native lands as a denomination, and the Native Christians come back and go, okay, so when are you going to give us back our lands?
Yeah. Hey, Ken, I know that you had some teaching material for mostly white churches, in terms of having people of color represented, and in terms of teaching and interpreting the Bible, to speak to those who are in powers, in places of power and privilege. Could you say a little bit more about
Sure.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. This was a book by I think a Cuban American scholar who's a Christian, who is pointing out the obvious that is missed most of the time by the dominant culture, and those of us who have been educated in the dominant white culture, is like the Bible is written basically for and to people on the margins. Okay, and especially after the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine became a Christian officially and made Christianity the official religion, and then the Holy Roman Empire. Until that time, the Christianity and Christians were seen as this offshoot, this people to be martyred, persecuted. But once they became part of the empire, then I think the thinking of the empire thinking began to percolate through, and then you get the Holy Catholic Church, whatever. And so the church began to read and interpret the Bible from the place of power and privilege,
Mm-hmm.
to as simple human people do, to reinforce its own position. Okay. And yet, when anyone today, you go back and you read it from the position of the leper, from the Canaanite woman, from the woman caught in adultery, from the Samaritan, like on and on and on and on and on. The Bible really is only good news to the people on the margin who don't have the privilege. Okay. So this author is arguing that maybe today, maybe always, but especially today, God wants the people at the center of the current Christian paradigm to be desperately, not just hospitably welcoming people from the margins to come in and read scripture together and to kind of help the scales fall from our eyes, but to do this out of desperation, because we basically, left to our own devices, become Pharisees and Sadducees, and we cannot save ourselves. And it's only when, right? So I had an experience when I started doing the work with the LGBTQ people, and we're on Acts chapter 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Okay, I don't know how many times you've taught that, preached that. I can't remember how many times, but I've never had a sexual minority, open sexual minority in the group until now. Okay, so I go through the passage and I'm moving on, and one of the queer people goes, "Can we just sit for a moment in the question of why did God choose a eunuch to be the first non-Jewish convert recorded in the Bible?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? It's just a word, right? And they're like, no, in fact, as I'm reading the passage from the Isaiah scroll, I mean, he's basically seeing his experience of being castrated and made a eunuch in there. That's how he came to Christ, is because he saw that God completely identified with his life and his journey. And I'm like, I am deaf, dumb, and blind.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So I feel like they can be the good Samaritans, if you will, right? They're the wrong race. They worship God on the wrong mountain. The people that pass them, and in fact, the beat up traveler is the race that has persecuted him. And yet, because he's in touch with his own pain, he's not just dwelling on it. He has the potential to connect to the pain of even the privileged. And he ministered to him and anointed his wounds and took care of him. And the author is arguing women, poor people, people of color, sexual minorities. There's all these people that we've made such an effort to lock out of our existence. God may be having them come into our midst to actually save us. So it's not just trying to be a nice church. It's actually to have God kind of redeem us from our worst devices.
Wow, that's powerful, Ken. Speaking of marginalized communities, this will be my last question for you. I know that you and I kind of grew up in the evangelical traditions, and over the years, with open hearts and open minds, and being led in different kinds of ways, I can't speak for you, but I think we're kind of on the same trajectory, that we've kind of changed over the years. And I know that you led your congregation through a really thoughtful but painful process in terms of being more of an LGBTQ community affirming. And I wonder if you could take a few minutes to tell us about what happened in your church and how it came to be.
Yeah, I have had a number of conversations with pastors much earlier on this journey. And the thing I always make sure to tell them is, you can't just lead your church on this journey if you yourself haven't been going on it personally. Okay. Now, some of them are because their kids are now coming out to them. Okay. That wasn't my case. My daughter is definitely a gay ally, but she's straight. Okay. And so in a lot of ways, I'm kind of the outlier in like, oh, I didn't change my position in this because there's someone I love dearly that it identifies as a sexual minority. So in some ways, people kind of have to pay attention more.
Yeah.
I just felt through a series of experiences that God said, as much as you went through all this rigmarole to become a pastor, and it's become such a passion of yours, you have been happily ignoring a section of my people. And as far as being a pastor to them, you suck.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, let's see who, and I finally realized, like, yeah, if I suspected someone in the past of being gay, I would just like, don't ask, don't tell. Or if they were to come out and they want me to deal with it, I was just happy when they left. Okay. But God brought me to this place of saying, you know what? I'm now calling you to spend down your reputation. on a group of people. They can't add to it. They can only take away from it. And this all came during a dream. And I said, what? And it's like, and God said, this is as much to save you from dying of an overinflated ego. Like I, as much as you to, help some other powerless people. And so I didn't even really have openly gay friends. And so I said yes to God, and okay, I told Snoopy, I go, buckle your seatbelt, we're going down, but, little by little, I began to get to know more gay people, even secular gay Asian people in LA. And we began to trust each other. And then there was 2 lay women in our church who were very progressive and very much wanting to have our church become this safe, affirming place. And I just said, we can't do this right now. It's just going to split our church in 2. So you have to wait until I say it's okay, right? And I said, in the meantime, if you want to have a group in your house, knock yourself out. And they go, no, that's still marginalizing people already marginalized. We want it in the bulletin, announced on Sunday, held on campus during adult Sunday school. And I'm like, I get it, but not right now. So they waited for 3 years. Wow. Still poking me, okay? Yeah. And I love these 2 women to death. I respect them to no end, right? So that's why, we work together. So we launched with 5 people after 3 years. By the time I retired, there were 75 to 100 coming.
Wow.
Okay?
Wow.
And I would call these people spiritually homeless. Many of them had gone to Christian colleges like Biola and APU, right? And some went to Fuller, right? Some went to Wheaton College. Some went to Talbot, right? And they weren't comfortable going to like a metropolitan community church because that was emphasizing just the gay part. They said they don't talk about Jesus enough. And they said, yeah. So he goes, I'm totally a Christian. It's just that I was self-loathing this part of me, and I, in order not to kill myself, I believe God now has fully affirmed that he made me this way, and so I need to be in a church where I'm not, that part of me is not ignored, but neither is it the thing. And our church probably, over the 7 years that we went on this journey, we probably saw about 30% of the people leave, and the magic number is 40%. So I'm feeling pretty good about 30, okay? But here's the thing. I found out that this one family that left, when I retired, I went on a farewell tour of the small groups, and this family was still going to their small group. So this guy showed up especially to tell me why he wasn't there. And he says, Pastor Ken, I want you to understand, I work for the Justice Department. I have many gay and lesbian colleagues that I love and respect. We're not there anymore, not because of this issue and what you're doing on this. Our kids started taking swimming lessons on Sundays, and this other church's Sunday school time matches our swimming lesson schedule better.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, Gerald, I would have never come up with that one on my own. And so I stopped beating myself up. They're like, you know what? There's one God, sovereign over all. God only sees one church. Not all churches are being led to do this. But in the meantime, there's very few churches like what these people are looking for. And I think, again, just like the Good Samaritan thing, we're that beat up traveler. I'm desperate to have them come and bring their pain and their experience of God in ways that I have so much privilege I can't even begin to access.
Well, Ken, thanks for sharing that. That's very meaningful to me because I think we all want to be compassionate, but sometimes we put kind of limits on our compassion. And I think it's when we're most uncomfortable that's when it really rises. I think the cream rises. So I really appreciate those words from you. You were talking about resources. Would there be some particular books that you would recommend to our folks in terms of, especially about the Asian American? I have a couple that I want to share, but I wanted to ask you if you might have a couple of reasons, or maybe even particular podcasts or.
Yeah. There's a classic book by Ronald Takaki. I think he still is on faculty, Strangers from a Different Shore. Just to see that not all immigrants came from the East through Ellis Island. But there's a lot more contemporary stuff. I'm trying to, I would think the Soong Chan Ra book with Mark Charles.
Unsettled Truths.
Unsettled Truth. Yeah. That is a must read. And that's beyond obviously the Asian American thing, but understanding the hold, the dominant hold that white conservative Christians have had on even Christianity, you know, and the influence and impact in this country.
Mhm.
Podcast wise, you know, definitely I believe that not every episode, you know, it depends on the guest, but for your listeners that want to learn more about the variety of Asians that are out there and what they're up to and what, you know, things that they've had to surmount, definitely that. I have had a number of queer and trans Asian Americans, some of them Christians, some
Yeah.
parents.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a safe way to learn stories.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to go to the Castro district and hang out or whatever, it's like, okay, but here I created a safe space. They're willing to trust me and trust the listeners. You know, they're going to share these things. There's a really one that I listen to. It's like 3 episodes a week called Straight White American Jesus.
Yeah.
Right.
I've been listening to that too after hearing you.
Yeah. So Dr. Brad Onishi, he's Hapa Japanese, used to be, you know, up to his earlobes in evangelical Orange County Christianity. Now identifies as kind of a spiritual secularist.
Yeah.
But his perspective and understanding from an academic point of view about what's going on, and certainly the history and the place of Christian nationalism, I found very invaluable.
Yeah.
So again, that's another way to learn what the history has been, learn what's going on, how it's relevant today.
Great. And folks who are listening, we'll send that out to an email to you. And I want to share a couple resources with you. If you have Netflix, there's a series. There's one season of it called Amends, Amends, Amends. And episode 6 in particular is one that you have to watch. It's about the immigrant experience. And along with that, you know, one of my guests last year was Erica Lee, who's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Minnesota. And I shared this last week with you. It's called America for Americans.
Oh, yeah.
It's called The History of Xenophobia in the United States. This really is a must read for all of us. And then there's a PBS series called Asian Americans. Yes. And I hope that you might be able to get that. Now, this coming Friday, there's a workshop on how to be allies to the Asian American community. And it's sponsored by a group called Holla Back. And their website is the letter I, hollaback.org. And you can sign up for this workshop on Friday. And again, we'll put this out in an email to all of you. Ken, thank you so much. We've come to our hour, and I really appreciate your time with us. And I don't see anyone in the Q&A section here, but well, actually, if you have a minute or two, Ken, if someone has a question, if you'd like to ask, you know, if you have a question for us, we'd be happy to address it if you'd like. If not, as you're thinking about it, I also want to mention to you, in the second Wednesday in June, my guest will be Dr. Satsuki Ina. She's a psychotherapist, and she was born actually in one of the incarceration camps during the war in Tule Lake. And that has formed some of her life, obviously. And in her practice, she's really interested in generational and community traumas. And so when I read about her and heard about her, I thought that she'd be a wonderful guest. So join me for that interview on the second Wednesday in June. Well, Ken, thank you again for being with us, and I really appreciate your time. And please say hi to Snoopy for me, and yeah, best wishes to you all around.
Yeah, and again, I apologize to all your listeners for messing up last week. You're part of a gracious church. They still sent me my honorarium check anyway. So
yeah, we're good about that.
Yeah. But again, thank you for having me on. I hope this has been helpful in different ways. You know, and it's just great connecting with an old classmate and friend.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Aloha.
Aloha.